The rain had been falling relentlessly for 3 days, turning the sky into a canvas of unbroken gray. Thunder growled in the distance, and torrents of water rushed through the gutters, cascading over their edges like miniature waterfalls. 12-year-old Leo Carter sat by the window of his modest home, watching the water puddles outside ripple with each gust of wind. The street, usually bustling with neighbors, was eerily quiet except for the faint sound of rescue sirens in the distance. "Leo, close the window. It's freezing," his mother, Amelia, said sharply. She was standing by the kitchen door, clutching a bucket of water she had just fetched from the nearby collection barrel. Her voice carried a mix of urgency and worry, emotions that the storm had awakened within her. "Yes, Mom," Leo replied, but his hands hesitated on the window frame. The scene outside captivated him, neighbors hurrying with bags and suitcases, their faces tense with anxiety. Amelia walked over, wiping her hands on her apron. "Stop staring, Leo. This rain might last for days. Stay inside and look after Mia. I don't want you going out in this weather." Leo turned to his mother. Her voice was firm, but he could see the worry etched on her face. She had every reason to feel this way. Years ago, during another flood, they had lost almost everything, including Leo's grandfather. Leo still remembered the screams, the desperate cries for help, and the guilt of being too young to do anything. "I understand, Mom," Leo said, his voice quiet but his resolve clear. Amelia sighed and went back to the kitchen. Leo returned his gaze to the window, his thoughts swirling. He couldn't sit still. Something deep inside him refused to let him ignore the rising waters and the neighbors struggling around them. His mind flashed to Mrs. Harper, an elderly woman who lived alone at the end of the street. She'd been kind to him over the years, often baking cookies and telling him stories about her youth. She's all alone, Leo thought, his heart sinking. Without another word, he grabbed his old raincoat and headed to the door. "Where are you going?" Amelia asked, her voice sharper now. "To check on Mrs. Harper," Leo replied. "I won't go far, I promise." Amelia frowned, clearly torn between stopping him and knowing how stubborn her son could be. "Be quick, Leo, and come back immediately." He nodded, pulling on his boots. The raincoat offered little protection from the relentless downpour. Within minutes, he was soaked, icy water seeping into his clothes and chilling him to the bone. The streets had transformed into rivers, with water reaching up to his ankles. Debris floated by, sticks, plastic bottles, even a child's toy. As he approached Mrs. Harper's house, he noticed the faint glow of a candle through the window. The sight filled him with relief. She was still there. "Mrs. Harper, it's Leo," he shouted, pounding on the wooden door. The door creaked open, revealing the frail figure of the elderly woman. She clutched a small suitcase, her face pale and lined with worry. "Leo, what are you doing here? You should be at home," she said, her voice trembling. "I came to help. You need to leave now. The water's rising fast, and it's not safe here," Leo insisted. Mrs. Harper hesitated, looking down at her suitcase. "I've lived here my whole life. I don't know if I can leave it all behind." "You have to," Leo said firmly. "Things can be replaced. You can't." His words seemed to snap her out of her hesitation. She nodded, allowing Leo to help her into a coat and boots. Together, they stepped out into the storm, the water now reaching up to their knees. Leo wrapped an arm around her to steady her as they waded through the powerful current. Each step was a battle against the force of the water and the slippery debris beneath their feet. When they reached higher ground where several neighbors had gathered, Leo felt a wave of relief. Mrs. Harper clutched his hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Leo. I don't know what would have happened without you," she whispered. Leo gave a small, reassuring smile. "I'm just doing what I can." But as he stood there, catching his breath, another sound reached his ears, a faint, desperate cry for help. His heart clenched. Someone else was in trouble. Turning to Mrs. Harper, he said, "Stay here. I need to check on something." "Leo, no, you've done enough," she pleaded, but Leo was already running back into the storm. The rain pelted his face, and the cries grew louder as he approached a large house a few streets away. It was Mrs. Delaney's home, a grand yet isolated building. She was known as the reclusive neighbor, rarely interacting with anyone. "Mrs. Delaney," Leo shouted, pounding on the door. For a moment, there was silence. Then, A faint voice called out, "Help me, please." Leo's heart raced. He tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. The water pressure outside must have jammed it shut. Quickly scanning the house, he noticed a small window that wasn't fully submerged. Without hesitation, he climbed up, pried it open, and squeezed inside. Inside, the air was cold and damp, the water already flooding the first floor. Leo climbed the stairs, his legs aching from exhaustion. At the top, he found Mrs. Delaney, trembling and clutching the stair railing. "You came," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "Don't worry," Leo said, steadying her with his hand. "I'll get you out of here." As the water continued to rise, Leo's mind raced for a solution. He knew time was running out, but he wasn't about to give up. The rain continued to hammer the roof of Mrs. Delaney's house, each drop echoing like a drumbeat of urgency. The water had reached the top of the staircase, licking at the edges of the floor where she stood trembling. "We can't stay here any longer," Leo said firmly, scanning the room for a way out. "The water's rising too fast." "But how?" Mrs. Delaney's voice was weak, her fear evident in the way she gripped the railing with trembling hands. "The front door is blocked. And I can't swim. If I fall." "You won't fall," Leo interrupted, his voice steady despite the growing dread in his chest. "I'll make sure of it." He moved quickly, dragging a couch toward the window. The heavy furniture resisted, its legs scraping against the flooded floor. But Leo's determination didn't falter. Climbing onto the couch, he wrestled with the swollen window frame, the paint peeling under his hands. With a final push, the window creaked open, and a gust of cold wind slapped his face, carrying the scent of rain and desperation. "Mrs. Delaney," he said, turning back to her, "we're going out this way. I'll help you climb through, and then we'll get to the roof of the shed next door. It's safer there." She hesitated, staring out at the swirling floodwaters below. Pieces of debris floated by, and the thought of stepping into that chaos froze her in place. "I can't," she whispered, shaking her head. "I'll fall." "You won't," Leo reassured her. "I'll be right here with you. But we have to go now, or the water will get too high." Her eyes locked onto his, searching for reassurance. Despite his youth, Leo's determination shone brightly, like a beacon cutting through the storm. With a deep, shuddering breath, she nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice trembling. Leo climbed out first, his feet finding a narrow ledge just below the window. The rain stung his face, and the ledge was slick with water. But he held on, steadying himself. "Take my hand," he called to her. Mrs. Delaney climbed onto the couch, her movements slow and unsteady. When she reached the window, Leo grasped her hand firmly, guiding her out. The moment her feet touched the ledge, she gasped, clutching his arm tightly. "Don't look down," Leo instructed. "Just follow me." Step by step, they edged their way along the narrow ledge toward the shed. The rain poured mercilessly, soaking them both to the bone. Below them, the floodwaters churned, carrying fragments of wood and furniture that smashed against the house with frightening force. When they reached the corner of the house, Leo stopped. The gap between the roof of the shed and the ledge was wider than he'd anticipated. For a moment, he hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'll jump first," he said, turning to Mrs. Delaney. "Then I'll help you across." "No, Leo, it's too dangerous," she protested. "I'll be fine," he said, giving her a reassuring smile. "Just trust me." He stepped back, took a deep breath, and ran forward. For a split second, he was airborne, the wind rushing past him. Then his feet hit the roof of the shed with a hard thud. He stumbled but managed to steady himself, grabbing the edge of the roof to keep from slipping. "Your turn," he called out, extending his hand toward her. Mrs. Delaney stood frozen, her eyes wide with fear. The gap seemed impossibly large, and the thought of falling into the raging water below paralyzed her. "I can't," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You can," Leo said firmly. "I'll catch you. You just have to jump." She shook her head, but the urgency in his voice broke through her fear. Taking a deep breath, she bent her knees and pushed off the ledge. Leo lunged forward, his hands outstretched. He caught her wrists just as she landed, her feet slipping on the slick roof tiles. Straining with all his strength, he pulled her up until she was safely beside him. For a moment, they both sat there, breathing heavily, the sound of the storm raging around them. "Thank you," Mrs. Delaney said, her voice choked with emotion. I don't know how you did it, but you saved me. We're not safe yet, Leo said, helping her to her feet. We need to get higher. They made their way to the center of the shed roof. Huddling together for warmth, the rain continued to pour, the wind howling through the night. Below them, the floodwaters surged, swallowing everything in their path. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, a faint light appeared in the distance. Leo squinted, his heart leaping with hope. A helicopter, he shouted, waving his arms frantically. The sound of the rotors grew louder. Cutting through the storm, the helicopter hovered above them, its searchlight illuminating the roof. A rescue worker leaned out, lowering the harness. Put this on, Leo said, helping Mrs. Delaney into the harness. She looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. What about you? I'll go after you, he said, just hold on tight. The harness lifted Mrs. Delaney into the air, and Leo watched as she was pulled to safety. When the harness came back down, he secured it around himself, gripping the straps tightly. As he was lifted into the helicopter, relief flooded him. Inside, Mrs. Delaney grabbed his hand, her eyes brimming with tears. You're a hero, Leo. You didn't just save me, you gave me a second chance. Leo looked out the window at the flooded neighborhood below. The devastation was overwhelming, but he knew this was only the beginning. There was still so much to do. As the helicopter carried Leo and Mrs. Delaney away from her collapsed house, he peered down at the chaos below. His neighborhood, once a lively community, was now an expanse of murky water. Only rooftops and treetops pierced the surface. The sight filled him with both dread and determination. Leo, are you okay? One of the rescue workers asked, noticing the boy's intense gaze. I'm fine, he said, though his mind was racing. He couldn't shake the thought of others who might still be trapped, waiting for help that might never come. The helicopter landed in a school courtyard that had been transformed into a temporary shelter. Rescue workers rushed to assist Mrs. Delaney as Leo climbed out, his legs shaky from exhaustion and the cold. Leo, he turned at the sound of his mother's voice. Amelia was running toward him, her face streaked with rain and tears. Behind her, his younger sister Mia clutched a small bag tightly to her chest. Mom, Mia, Leo shouted, rushing into their embrace. The warmth of their hug cut through the cold that had seeped into his bones. You're safe, Amelia whispered, holding him tightly. I was so scared. I promised I'd come back, Leo said, his voice trembling with emotion. Mia clung to him, her small arms wrapped around his waist. I thought you wouldn't make it, she said, her voice muffled against his coat. Leo knelt to meet her eye level, brushing her damp hair out of her face. I'll always come back, Mia, I promise. As they entered the shelter, the noise of families reuniting and children crying filled the air. The shelter was chaotic, but Leo was grateful to be with his family again. They found a corner to rest, and Amelia handed him a dry blanket. People are saying you saved Mrs. Delaney, she said softly, her eyes a mix of pride and concern. Leo nodded, pulling the blanket around himself. She needed help. I couldn't leave her there. Amelia sighed, shaking her head. You're so much like your grandfather, always putting others first. Before Leo could respond, a distant cry echoed through the shelter. It wasn't the sound of someone in the shelter, it was coming from outside. His heart skipped a beat. Mom, did you hear that? Hear what? Amelia asked, her brow furrowed. Someone's calling for help, Leo said, standing abruptly. Leo, wait. Amelia grabbed his arm. You've done enough. The rescue teams will handle it. They might not get there in time, Leo said, his voice resolute. I had to check. Amelia's face tightened, torn between stopping him and understanding the fire in her son's heart. Finally, she nodded. Be careful, Leo, please. Leo darted back out into the storm, his rain-soaked clothes clinging to his skin. The cry for help grew louder as he made his way toward the sound. It was coming from the Graywood house, a large property on the edge of the neighborhood. The house had been abandoned for years, but Leo remembered hearing that a new tenant, Mr. Foster, had moved in recently. As he approached the house, he could see a dim light flickering inside. The water outside had risen to nearly waist height, and debris floated everywhere, making it difficult to move. Mr. Foster, are you in there? Leo shouted, banging on the front door. Help, I'm trapped upstairs, came the faint reply. The urgency in the man's voice spurred Leo into action. He tried the door, but it was stuck, likely swollen shut from the water. Scanning the house, he spotted a second-floor window partially open. "I'm coming," Leo shouted, climbing onto a pile of debris to reach the window. The wood was slippery, and his hands ached from the cold, but he managed to hoist himself up and squeeze through the window. Inside, the house was eerily silent except for the sound of water sloshing below. The first floor was completely flooded, furniture bobbing in the murky water like ghostly remnants of a life interrupted. "Mr. Foster? Up here," the voice called. Leo climbed the staircase, his wet boots squeaking on the wooden steps. At the top, he found Mr. Foster, a middle-aged man with a thick beard, sitting on a desk, clutching a flashlight. "Thank God," Mr. Foster said, his voice thick with relief. "I thought no one would hear me." "We need to get out of here," Leo said. "The water's still rising." "But how?" Mr. Foster asked, his eyes darting to the floodwater below. "The stairs are nearly submerged, and the door's blocked." "We'll go out the window," Leo said, already scanning the room for something to help. His eyes landed on a sturdy curtain rod. "We can use this to stabilize ourselves when we get to the roof." Leo helped Mr. Foster climb out the window, guiding him onto the roof of the house. The rain continued to pour, making the tiles slippery underfoot. They moved cautiously, each step a battle against the howling wind. As they reached the edge of the roof, Leo spotted the flashing lights of a rescue boat in the distance. "Over here," he shouted, waving his arms. The boat turned toward them, its engine roaring as it cut through the floodwaters. A rescue worker threw a rope to Leo, who caught it and secured it to the chimney. "Climb down carefully," Leo instructed Mr. Foster. The man hesitated, his fear evident, but Leo's steady presence gave him the courage to move. Step by step, they made their way down the rope and into the boat. Once aboard, Mr. Foster collapsed onto the seat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You saved my life, kid," he said, his voice heavy with gratitude. Leo simply nodded, his mind already racing to the next person who might need help. As the rescue boat navigated through the flooded streets, the sound of rushing water filled the air. Leo sat quietly, his arms wrapped around himself for warmth. His body ached from exhaustion, but his mind raced with concern for others still trapped. The boat reached the school shelter, where volunteers helped Mr. Foster climb out. The middle-aged man turned to Leo, his eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you," Mr. Foster said, gripping Leo's shoulder. "You didn't just save me, you gave me another chance to live." Leo gave him a small nod, mumbling, "I'm just glad you're safe." Inside the shelter, Leo reunited with his mother and Mia. Amelia's face lit up with relief when she saw her son walking through the doors. "Leo," she exclaimed, rushing to hug him, "you've been out there too long." "I'm fine, Mom," Leo said, though his voice betrayed his exhaustion. "You've done so much already," Amelia said, brushing damp hair from his forehead. "Please, just rest." Leo reluctantly agreed, sinking into a corner of the shelter. Despite his aching muscles and heavy eyelids, his mind stayed alert. Around him, families huddled together, some crying softly while others whispered words of encouragement. Mrs. Delaney, sitting nearby, caught his eye and offered a warm smile. Though she looked tired, her gratitude was unmistakable. "You're a remarkable young man, Leo," she said softly. Leo shrugged, feeling a little embarrassed. "I just did what needed to be done." Her expression turned thoughtful. "Not everyone would risk their life for a stranger. You remind me that even in the worst times, there's still kindness in the world." The following morning, the rain finally began to subside. The floodwaters remained high, but the skies were no longer pouring down torrents. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, the shelter buzzed with activity. Rescue teams worked tirelessly to coordinate relief efforts, while volunteers handed out food and blankets. Leo couldn't stay idle. Despite Amelia's protests, he joined the volunteers, helping distribute supplies and comfort the frightened children. As the day progressed, the schoolyard began to fill with more survivors from the neighborhood. Some arrived by boat, others on makeshift rafts. Among them was Mr. Jenkins, an elderly man who had lived on the same street as Leo's family for decades. "Leo," Mr. Jenkins called out, waving a wrinkled hand, "I heard what you did. Saved not one but two people. You're a hero." I'm no hero, Mr. Jenkins, Leo replied, his face reddening. I just couldn't stand by. Call it what you like, son, but you've inspired the whole neighborhood, Mr. Jenkins said. We've got a long road ahead, but thanks to you, we'll make it through. As the floodwaters began to recede in the days that followed, survivors returned to what was left of their homes. The sight was devastating. Houses were filled with mud, furniture destroyed, and personal belongings scattered like debris. Despite the despair, a sense of determination began to take root in the community. Leo's family returned to their house, which had suffered significant damage. The front door was broken, mud covered the floors, and a large section of the roof had caved in. Amelia covered her mouth, holding back a sob, while Mia clung to Leo's hand. It's okay, Mom, Leo said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We'll fix it, together. Amelia nodded, taking a deep breath. You're right, we've been through worse. We'll rebuild. Over the next few days, Leo threw himself into the cleanup efforts, not just for his own home but for the entire neighborhood. Armed with a shovel, he worked tirelessly, clearing mud and debris from houses. Other neighbors joined in, their spirits lifted by Leo's unrelenting determination. Mrs. Delaney surprised everyone by returning to the neighborhood with a bold announcement. I'm starting a relief fund, she said, standing in the middle of the street with a small group of volunteers. Leo's bravery reminded me that we're all in this together. I have the resources to help, and I'm going to use them. Amelia, overhearing the conversation, approached Mrs. Delaney with tears in her eyes. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me, Mrs. Delaney replied. Thank your son. He reminded me what it means to be part of a community. As materials for repairs began arriving, funded by Mrs. Delaney's relief fund, the neighborhood transformed into a hive of activity. Leo worked alongside neighbors, rebuilding fences, patching roofs, and painting walls. Though the work was exhausting, the laughter and camaraderie that filled the air kept everyone's spirits high. One afternoon, as Leo was hammering planks to fix a broken fence, Mr. Jenkins approached him with a bottle of lemonade. Here, son, you've earned it, Mr. Jenkins said, sitting beside him. Thanks, Mr. Jenkins, Leo said, wiping sweat from his brow. The elderly man looked around at the bustling neighborhood, his eyes glistening. You know, Leo, this place was just a collection of houses before. But now, it's a community, and that's because of you. Leo smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. It's not just me, everyone's pitching in. Maybe, Mr. Jenkins said, but you gave them the courage to start. By the end of the week, the first house in the neighborhood was fully repaired. It wasn't much, but it was a symbol of hope for everyone. As more homes were restored, the streets came alive again with laughter and the sound of children playing. But Leo knew this was just the beginning. There were still families in need of help, and he was determined to see it through. The morning sun glinted off the muddy streets as neighbors gathered to discuss the progress of the cleanup. Leo stood with his mother, Amelia, and younger sister, Mia, as they listened to updates from the volunteers. Spirits were high, but the challenges ahead were evident. Some homes were beyond repair, and resources were stretched thin. As the meeting wrapped up, the sound of a sleek engine broke through the chatter. All heads turned as a glossy black car slowly navigated the debris-laden road and stopped in the middle of the street. The driver stepped out first, followed by Mrs. Delaney, who had a determined look on her face. The crowd murmured in surprise as Mrs. Delaney, usually known for her reclusive nature, addressed them. Good morning, everyone, she began, her voice carrying over the group. I know the past days have been difficult for all of us, but I want you to know that we're not alone in this. This neighborhood is my home too, and I'm here to help. Amelia stepped forward, her brow furrowed in curiosity. Mrs. Delaney, what are you saying? Mrs. Delaney smiled warmly. I've started a relief fund to help rebuild our neighborhood. It's already being used to bring in supplies. But that's just the beginning. She turned to Leo, who stood silently beside his mother. And I owe it all to this young man. His bravery inspired me to do something meaningful. Leo's cheeks flushed as all eyes turned to him. I didn't do anything special, he muttered. Nonsense, Mrs. Delaney said firmly. You risked your life to save me. If a boy your age can show such courage and selflessness, the least I can do is give back to the community. She raised an envelope in her hand and stepped closer to Amelia. This is for your family. To help repair your home. And I want you to know that every family here will receive the same support." Amelia hesitated, her hands trembling as she accepted the envelope. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank Leo," Mrs. Delaney replied with a smile. "And thank yourselves. Together, we'll rebuild this neighborhood better than ever." In the days that followed, trucks loaded with building materials began arriving, funded by Mrs. Delaney's generosity. Workers and volunteers worked side by side with neighbors to rebuild homes, clear debris, and restore the streets. The air buzzed with energy, and a sense of hope replaced the despair that had lingered after the flood. Leo didn't stop for a moment. Whether it was hauling bricks, painting walls, or organizing supplies, he was always in the thick of the action. His dedication didn't go unnoticed. One afternoon, as he helped patch up a section of Mr. Jenkins' roof, a woman in a clean suit approached him. She looked out of place amid the muddy streets, but her warm smile put Leo at ease. "Are you Leo Carter?" she asked, extending her hand. Yes," Leo said, shaking her hand awkwardly. "My name is Angela Grant. I work with a national relief organization. Mrs. Delaney told me about you, about how you've been helping your community. We're impressed by what you've done." Leo scratched the back of his head. "I didn't do it alone. Everyone's been working hard." Angela nodded. "That may be true, but your actions inspired others. That's why we'd like to invite you to speak at an upcoming youth leadership conference. We think your story could inspire even more people." Leo blinked in surprise. "Me? Speak at a conference?" Angela smiled. "Yes, it's a chance to share what you've done here and show others the power of courage and community." The idea of speaking in front of a large audience made Leo nervous. But Amelia encouraged him. "You've done so much already," she said as they sat on their porch that evening. "This is a chance to let others see what a difference one person can make." "I don't know, Mom," Leo said, staring at the letter of invitation Angela had given him. "I'm not a hero. I'm just a kid who wanted to help. And that's exactly why your story matters," Amelia replied, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to be perfect to make a difference, Leo. You just have to care." In the meantime, the neighborhood continued to transform. Mrs. Delaney's relief fund grew as word of her generosity spread, attracting donations from outside the community. Roads were repaired, homes were rebuilt, and the park in the center of the neighborhood, once submerged in water, became a vibrant gathering place for children and families. Leo worked tirelessly, but he also began to see the bigger picture. It wasn't just about rebuilding houses, it was about rebuilding connections. Neighbors who had barely spoken before the flood now worked side by side, sharing stories, laughter, and hope. One afternoon, as Leo was helping repaint the community center, Mrs. Delaney approached him with 2 cups of lemonade. She handed him one and sat beside him on the steps. "You know, Leo," she began, her gaze fixed on the children playing in the park. "Before the flood, I kept to myself. I thought I didn't need anyone. But you changed that. You showed me the power of community." Leo sipped his lemonade, unsure how to respond. Mrs. Delaney turned to him, her expression warm. "This neighborhood has come back to life because of you. And because of what you've taught us." Leo smiled shyly. "I just wanted to help." "And you did," she said, "more than you realize." By the time the last floodwaters had receded, the neighborhood had taken on a new spirit. The streets were alive with the sounds of hammers, saws, and laughter. People who had once lived in quiet isolation now leaned on one another, rebuilding not just their homes but their sense of community. Leo worked harder than ever, splitting his time between helping his family restore their house and lending a hand to neighbors who needed extra support. Each day brought new challenges, but also small victories: a repaired roof, a cleared yard, a freshly painted wall. One morning, as Leo was shoveling debris from the Andersons' driveway, his friend Chris jogged up, his face flushed with excitement. "Leo, you've got to come to the park," Chris said, practically bouncing on his heels. "What's going on?" Leo asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "Mrs. Delaney's got some big news. And everyone's gathering there. It's about the neighborhood." Curious, Leo set down his shovel and followed Chris to the park. A crowd had already formed, buzzing with anticipation. Mrs. Delaney stood on a makeshift stage, a microphone in hand. Her demeanor, once reserved, was now warm and confident. Thank you all for being here. She began, her voice steady and filled with emotion. When the flood hit, we all faced immense loss. But instead of succumbing to despair, we came together. And now, look around. Look at what we've accomplished. The crowd murmured in agreement, heads nodding as they glanced at the repaired homes and cleaned streets. Thanks to the generosity of donors and the hard work of every single one of you, we've raised enough funds not only to rebuild but to improve. Starting today, we'll be creating a permanent community relief fund to ensure we're never unprepared for a disaster again. The crowd erupted into applause. Leo clapped along, feeling a swell of pride. Mrs. Delaney continued, and none of this would have been possible without the courage and determination of a young man who reminded us of the strength we have when we stand together. She turned her gaze to Leo. Leo Carter, she said, gesturing for him to join her on the stage. Leo froze, his heart racing. Chris nudged him forward with a grin. Go on, hero. Reluctantly, Leo climbed onto the stage, his cheeks burning as the crowd cheered. Mrs. Delaney placed a hand on his shoulder. This young man didn't just save lives during the flood, she said, her voice filled with emotion. He saved our sense of community. Leo, your bravery inspired us to rebuild, not just our homes, but our connections with one another. On behalf of everyone here, thank you. The applause was deafening. Leo ducked his head, overwhelmed by the attention. I just wanted to help, he said into the microphone, his voice cracking slightly. I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. But everything we've done since the flood, that's because of all of you. We're in this together. The crowd roared their approval. And for the first time, Leo allowed himself to feel proud of what he'd accomplished. Over the following weeks, the neighborhood's transformation continued. The Community Relief Fund brought in not only materials but also skilled workers who taught residents new skills. Leo learned how to plaster walls, install shingles, and even mix concrete. But it wasn't just about construction. The park became a hub for gatherings. From potlucks to planning meetings, children played on the newly rebuilt playground, their laughter filling the air. Adults shared stories, lending tools and advice as they worked. One afternoon, as Leo helped paint the Martinez family's front porch, he noticed Amelia watching him from their yard. She waved him over, and he set down his brush to join her. "What's up, Mom?" he asked, brushing paint off his hands. Amelia smiled, her eyes shimmering with pride. "I was just thinking about how much you've grown. Not just in size, but in heart. You've brought this neighborhood together. Leo, that's something truly special." Leo shrugged, looking down at his shoes. "I didn't do it alone." Amelia placed a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe not, but you lit the spark." The progress wasn't without its setbacks. Supplies occasionally ran low, and disputes arose over how resources should be allocated. One afternoon, a heated argument broke out between two families over who should receive the next batch of roofing tiles. "I've got kids who need a safe roof over their heads," shouted Mr. Evans, his face red with frustration. "And my wife's been sleeping under a tarp for 2 weeks," countered Mr. Patel. The argument escalated, drawing a crowd. Leo, who had been working nearby, stepped in. "Hey," he said, raising his voice, "this isn't helping anyone. We're all in this together. Remember?" The two men turned to him, their anger faltering. "We'll figure this out," Leo continued, his tone firm but calm. "Maybe we can split the materials. Or someone can loan their extra tarps until more supplies arrive. Let's find a solution instead of tearing each other apart." After a tense moment, the men nodded reluctantly. With Leo's mediation, a compromise was reached, and the argument dissolved. "You got a gift, kid," Mr. Jenkins said later, clapping Leo on the back. "Not just for fixing things, but for bringing people together." As the weeks turned into months, the neighborhood was almost unrecognizable. Freshly painted homes lined the streets. Gardens bloomed with new life, and the park bustled with activity. But more than the physical changes, there was a renewed sense of unity that hadn't existed before the flood. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Leo sat on the porch of his now repaired home. Mia joined him, holding a glass of lemonade. "Leo, can I ask you something?" she said, her voice small. "Of course," he replied, taking a sip of his drink. "Why do you help so much? You're always running around, working harder than anyone else." Leo thought for a moment before answering. "Because I know what it's like to feel helpless. During the last flood, I couldn't do anything to save Grandpa. But now, I can help, and I want to make sure no one else has to feel that way. Mia nodded, her admiration clear. When I grow up, I want to be like you. Leo smiled, ruffling her hair. You already are. The neighborhood, once devastated by floodwaters, now stood as a testament to resilience and unity. Each repaired house, freshly painted wall, and newly planted garden reflected not just hard work but a shared determination to rebuild stronger than before. For Leo, the transformation was deeply personal. Every step of the recovery had shown him the power of small acts, the strength of a community united, and his own ability to make a difference. One evening, as the sky faded into hues of orange and pink, Leo sat on the porch with his mother, Emilia, and his sister, Mia. The quiet hum of crickets filled the air, punctuated by the occasional laughter of children playing in the nearby park. Leo, Emilia said, breaking the peaceful silence, I need to talk to you about something. What is it, Mom? Leo asked, sitting up straighter. Emilia handed him a letter. The envelope was crisp, its contents official looking. It's from that relief organization Angela mentioned. They're inviting you to speak at the Youth Leadership Conference in the city. Leo stared at the letter, his heart pounding. He had almost forgotten about the invitation, dismissing it as something too big for someone like him. I don't know, Mom, he said, his voice hesitant. I'm not sure I'm the right person for this. I just helped out where I could. Emilia smiled gently. Leo, what you did wasn't just helping out. You brought this neighborhood together. You inspired all of us to keep going when things felt impossible. That's a story worth sharing. Mia chimed in, her voice full of excitement. You had to go. Leo, imagine how many people you can inspire. Leo looked between his mother and sister, their faith in him so clear. He took a deep breath and nodded. Okay, I'll do it. The next week passed in a blur of preparation. Angela visited to help Leo craft his speech, and neighbors offered their support and encouragement. Mrs. Delaney stopped by one afternoon with a notebook in hand. This is for you, she said, handing it to Leo. What is it? He asked, flipping through the pages. Notes from my journals, Mrs. Delaney said with a smile. Things I've learned over the years about resilience and community. I thought they might help. Leo nodded gratefully, touched by her thoughtfulness. Thank you, Mrs. Delaney. I'll make sure to include what I've learned from you too. The day of the conference arrived, and Leo found himself standing in front of a massive auditorium filled with young people from across the country. The stage lights were bright, and the buzz of the crowd was intimidating. He clutched his note cards tightly, his palms sweaty. Angela gave him a reassuring smile as she introduced him. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to present Leo Carter, a young man who turned a moment of disaster into a beacon of hope for his community. The applause was thunderous as Leo stepped onto the stage. He took a deep breath, scanning the audience, though his nerves threatened to overwhelm him. He thought of his mother, Mia, and the neighbors back home who had believed in him. I'm not a hero, he began, his voice steady but humble. I'm just a kid who wanted to help. He recounted the flood, the rescues of Mrs. Harper and Mrs. Delaney, and the months of rebuilding that followed. He spoke about the power of unity and how small acts of kindness can ripple outward to create lasting change. During the flood, I realized something important, Leo said, his voice growing more confident. We're stronger together. When we help each other, we're not just fixing what's broken, we're building something better. When he finished, the audience rose to their feet, their applause echoing through the auditorium. Leo felt a swell of pride. But more than that, a sense of purpose. After the conference, Leo returned home to a hero's welcome. Neighbors gathered in the park to celebrate his success, bringing food, music, and decorations. You were amazing, Leo, Chris said, slapping him on the back. The whole neighborhood's proud of you. I just told our story, Leo replied, smiling. This wasn't just me, it was all of us. In the weeks that followed, Leo's involvement in the community deepened. Inspired by the conference, he began organizing small projects to improve the neighborhood, planting trees, repairing playground equipment, and even starting a mentoring program for younger kids. One afternoon, as he helped build a new fence for the community garden, Mrs. Delaney approached him with a thoughtful expression. You found your calling, haven't you? She asked. Leo paused, considering her words. I think so. Helping people feels right. It's not about being a hero, it's about doing what you can for others. Mrs. Delaney nodded. You've learned a lesson that takes most people a lifetime to understand. Keep going, Leo. The world needs more people like you. After his return from the Youth Leadership Conference, Leo's life began to shift in unexpected ways. The story of his bravery and the neighborhood's resilience spread far beyond the city. News outlets wrote articles, and social media posts about his speech went viral. For Leo, the attention felt overwhelming at first, but he quickly realized the power of sharing his story. One morning, as he was repairing the playground swings with Chris, Angela arrived with a smile and a clipboard in hand. Leo, she began, I've got some good news. There's another opportunity for you to share your story. Leo wiped sweat from his brow. Another speech? Angela laughed. Not exactly. A national relief organization wants to partner with you to promote youth leadership in disaster recovery. They're launching a program to train young people to step up in emergencies. And they want you to be the face of it. Leo blinked, unsure how to respond. Me? But I'm just a kid from a small neighborhood. That's exactly why they want you. Angela said, you've proven that age doesn't matter when it comes to making a difference. You've inspired so many people. And this program could help others follow in your footsteps. The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and planning sessions. Leo found himself juggling his time between helping rebuild his neighborhood and preparing for his new role. The program, called Youth in Action, aimed to teach young people practical skills for disaster preparedness and community leadership. Angela helped Leo record a video message that would be sent to schools and youth organizations across the country. In it, he spoke directly to kids like him, encouraging them to believe in their ability to make a difference. Sometimes, it feels like the problems in the world are too big for us to handle, he said, looking into the camera. But I've learned that even small actions can create huge changes. Whether it's helping a neighbor, sharing supplies, or simply being there for someone in need, every little thing we do matters. As the program launched, Leo traveled to nearby towns and schools to speak with students. Each visit brought new stories of resilience and courage, as kids shared their own experiences of overcoming challenges. In one town, a girl named Emily approached him after his talk, her eyes bright with excitement. Leo, I loved your speech, she said. Last year, my family lost our home in a fire, and it felt like we'd never recover. But hearing about what you and your neighborhood did, it gives me hope. Leo smiled, feeling a pang of gratitude. You've already taken the first step, Emily. Just keep going, and don't be afraid to ask for help. You're stronger than you think. Back in the neighborhood, the impact of Leo's work was becoming even more apparent. Inspired by his efforts, more neighbors stepped forward to lead their own projects. The community relief fund grew, allowing for long-term improvements like a flood prevention system and a new community center. One evening, as Leo was finishing up a mural on the wall of the park, Mrs. Delaney approached with her usual basket of lemonade and cookies. Leo, she began, sitting beside him, you've done so much for this community. Have you thought about what's next for you? Leo set down his paintbrush, looking at the vibrant colors of the mural. I'm not sure. I love helping here, but after the conference and this program, I feel like I could do more. Maybe even beyond our neighborhood. Mrs. Delaney nodded thoughtfully. The world needs people like you, Leo. But don't forget, you'll always have a home here, no matter where your path takes you. In the months that followed, Leo's efforts expanded further. Through the Youth in Action program, he helped organize disaster response training sessions in schools and set up networks for young volunteers. His story continued to inspire others, sparking a movement of youth-led initiatives in communities across the country. One day, while visiting a town that had recently been hit by a hurricane, Leo stood in a makeshift shelter, speaking with families who had lost everything. As he handed out blankets and supplies, a young boy approached him, clutching a tattered notebook. Are you Leo Carter? The boy asked shyly. I am, Leo said, kneeling to meet his gaze. What's your name? Ethan, the boy replied. I heard about what you did after the flood. I want to help people too. Like you do. Leo's heart swelled with emotion. You can, Ethan. Helping isn't about being perfect, it's about doing what you can. And it sounds like you've already got the right idea. As Leo left the shelter that evening, he looked out at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set. He thought about how far he had come since the flood that had changed everything. What had started as a simple act of courage had grown into something much bigger, a movement fueled by hope, resilience, and the belief that anyone, no matter their age or circumstances, could make a difference. He smiled, the weight of the day's work fading into a sense of purpose. This was only the beginning. Leo's story had grown far beyond his small neighborhood. The Youth in Action program was thriving, with schools across the country incorporating disaster preparedness and leadership training into their curricula. Communities that had once felt isolated in the face of natural disasters now had networks of young volunteers ready to respond. Despite his growing responsibilities, Leo remained deeply connected to his neighborhood. Every weekend, he worked with neighbors to finalize long-term rebuilding projects. The community center, a hub for learning and gatherings, was nearing completion, and the park had transformed into a vibrant space where children played and families gathered. One afternoon, as Leo worked on planting trees in the park, Chris ran up, waving a flyer. "Leo, check this out," Chris said, thrusting the paper into his hands. The flyer announced a nationwide competition for young changemakers, with the winner receiving funding to expand their initiatives. Leo scanned the details. His interest piqued. "You should enter," Chris said, grinning. "Imagine what you could do with more resources." Leo hesitated. The idea was exciting, but the thought of competing for recognition felt strange. "It's not about winning, Chris. This is about helping people. And that's exactly why you deserve it," Chris insisted. "You're doing this for all the right reasons." After some encouragement from his family and friends, Leo submitted his application, outlining the work he'd done and his vision for the future of Youth in Action. Weeks passed, and though Leo tried to focus on his projects, the possibility of winning lingered in the back of his mind. One evening, as his family was sitting down to dinner, the phone rang. Amelia answered, her face lighting up as she handed the phone to Leo. "It's for you," she said, her eyes sparkling. Leo took the phone cautiously. "Hello? Leo Carter?" a warm voice said on the other end. "This is Sarah Coleman from the National Changemaker Awards. I'm thrilled to inform you that you've been selected as this year's winner." For a moment, Leo was speechless. "Wait, I won?" "Yes," Sarah said. "Your story and the work you've done with Youth in Action truly stood out to the judges. We'd like to invite you to our annual gala to receive your award and discuss how we can support your program further." Leo's family erupted into cheers as he hung up the phone. Amelia hugged him tightly, tears in her eyes. "I'm so proud of you," she said. Mia beamed. "You're going to be famous." Leo laughed, though his heart was racing. "It's not about that, Mia. It's about making sure we can help more people." The gala was held in a grand ballroom in the city. Leo felt out of place at first among the elegantly dressed guests. But he quickly realized they weren't there for appearances, they were there to celebrate change. As he took the stage to accept his award, he looked out at the crowd and felt the same nerves he'd experienced at the youth conference. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady. "I never set out to win awards or get recognition. When the flood hit my neighborhood, I was just a kid who wanted to help my neighbors. But what I learned during that time is something I think we all need to remember. No matter how small we feel, our actions can create ripples that change the world around us." The applause that followed was thunderous. After the event, several donors and organizations approached Leo, eager to partner with Youth in Action. The funding he received from the award allowed him to expand the program into more schools and communities, reaching thousands of young people. Back in his neighborhood, life continued to thrive. The community center officially opened with a ribbon-cutting ceremony attended by neighbors, volunteers, and even local officials. Inside, a plaque dedicated to Leo and his efforts was unveiled. "Leo Carter," it read, "a beacon of hope and a reminder that one person can make a difference." Mrs. Delaney, standing beside Leo, smiled warmly. "You've left a mark on this place, Leo, one that will never fade." The next phase of Youth in Action brought even more challenges and opportunities. Leo began organizing training camps where young people could learn first aid, disaster response techniques, and leadership skills. He traveled to communities recovering from wildfires, hurricanes, and earthquakes, bringing with him not just resources but a message of hope. One day, while visiting a town rebuilding after a tornado, Leo met a group of teenagers who had started their own initiative to support displaced families. "We heard about you and your program," one of them said. "It's why we decided to start this. You showed us that we could make a difference." Leo was deeply moved. The realization that his actions had inspired others to take initiative reinforced his belief in the power of small acts. As the months turned into years, Leo's work continued to grow. He remained grounded, always returning to his neighborhood to spend time with his family and friends. The lessons he'd learned during the flood stayed with him, shaping every decision he made. One evening, as he sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mia joined him, now a teenager with the same spark of determination he had carried as a boy. "Leo," she said, "I've been thinking about joining Youth in Action. I want to help, just like you did." Leo smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "You'd be amazing, Mia. Helping others is the best thing you can do." Mia grinned. "I learned that from you." The years that followed solidified Leo Carter's place as a leader in disaster recovery and community building. Youth in Action grew into a nationwide organization, empowering young people to take charge during crises and fostering the belief that anyone, no matter their age, could create meaningful change. One summer day, Leo returned to his neighborhood, now a thriving hub of activity and connection. Children played in the park he had helped rebuild. Families gathered in the community center for events, and the streets were lined with well-kept homes. The transformation was a far cry from the devastated landscape after the flood years ago. Walking through the neighborhood, Leo felt a deep sense of peace. He stopped by Mrs. Delaney's house, now surrounded by a vibrant garden she had nurtured since the recovery. She greeted him warmly, her face lighting up as she saw him. "Leo," she said, hugging him tightly, "it's always a joy to see you. You've been busy, I hear." Leo chuckled. "Busy is an understatement, Mrs. Delaney, but it's good to be home." They sat together on her porch, sipping lemonade as they watched the bustling activity of the neighborhood. "You've done something incredible here," Mrs. Delaney said, her voice filled with pride. "You didn't just rebuild this place, you gave it a heart." Leo smiled, looking out at the children playing tag in the park. "I couldn't have done it without everyone here. This neighborhood taught me what community really means." That evening, Leo and his family sat on the steps of their home, sharing a quiet moment together. Mia, now a confident teenager, spoke about her plans to lead a Youth in Action project at her school. "I want to start a club," she said excitedly. "We'll teach first aid, organize donation drives, and even work on disaster preparedness." Leo grinned. "Sounds like you're ready to take the reins." Mia, Amelia, sitting beside them, reached for Leo's hand. "You've inspired so many people, Leo, but you've also given our family a gift, hope. No matter what happens, I know we'll always have each other in this community." Leo looked at his mother, feeling a swell of gratitude. "I learned it all from you, Mom. You taught me to care, to stand up for others, and to believe in the power of kindness." The next day, the community hosted a celebration to honor the anniversary of the flood recovery. Families gathered in the park, sharing food, laughter, and stories of how far they had come. A stage had been set up in front of the community center, and Mrs. Delaney took the microphone to address the crowd. "Today," she began, "we celebrate not just the rebuilding of our neighborhood, but the spirit of unity that brought us together. And there's one person who sparked it all." She turned to Leo, who stood at the edge of the crowd. "Leo Carter, come up here." The crowd erupted in applause as Leo made his way to the stage, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment and pride. "Leo," Mrs. Delaney continued, "your courage, compassion, and unwavering dedication to this community have changed our lives. We are better, stronger, and more connected because of you." Leo took the microphone, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I'm honored by your words. But this was never about me. It was about us, our community, our strength, and our belief in each other. Together, we turned a disaster into an opportunity to grow. And I know that no matter what the future holds, we'll face it the same way, united." The applause that followed was deafening, and Leo looked out at the faces of his neighbors, each one filled with gratitude and hope. This was the moment he realized the true impact of his journey, not just the buildings rebuilt or the programs started, but the lives touched and the bonds formed. As the celebration wound down and the sun dipped below the horizon, Leo stood alone for a moment, gazing at the stars. The flood had taken so much from him and his community, but it had also given him a purpose, a path he was determined to follow. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Angela, asking about the next steps for youth in action. Smiling, Leo typed a quick reply. Let's make it bigger. There's still so much to do. Years later, Leo's name became synonymous with resilience and compassion. Youth in Action expanded internationally, training millions of young people to lead in times of crisis. Though he traveled extensively, Leo always returned to his neighborhood, where it all began. One day, as he walked through the park, he saw a group of children huddled together, planning something with an enthusiasm he recognized. Among them was a young boy holding a notebook, his face lit with determination. "Are you Leo Carter?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with wonder. "I am," Leo replied, crouching down to meet the boy's gaze. "What's your name?" "Daniel," the boy said. "I want to help people. Like you do." Leo smiled, feeling the familiar warmth of purpose. "You can, Daniel. It all starts with one small act of kindness. And before you know it, you'll change the world." As Leo stood, watching the children scatter with excitement, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. His journey had come full circle. But it was far from over. There would always be more to do, more lives to touch, and more ripples to create. And Leo Carter was ready for whatever came next.